All right, so this is about 3 to 6 months of researching and buying parts for the first phase of my build. Pretty excited about putting all this on the car. So let's go ahead and get into this. Behind me is a 2012 BMW 335is E92 chassis. This particular car is 54,000 miles. It has the M54 twin turbo V6 mated to the dual clutch transmission. This is the first video in a series of videos that I plan to do on this build that chronicle this build. The first one is going to be on stage 1, which is going to be a complete suspension overhaul. Before I get into that, I wanted to just talk about what my plans are for this channel. So it's not really to create another 335i or BMW technical step-by-step sort of channel. I really think there's a lot of good content on YouTube that covers that already, so I don't want to reinvent the wheel. Instead, I wanted to build a channel that would chronicle the build, that I could look back on, and that hopefully would help other people who are embarking on similar builds, whether it be on a 335i or any other car for that matter. So what I plan to do is talk about why I'm changing specific parts, why I chose those parts, what, if any, research I did when I was making that decision, what companies I talked to, what people I talked to, so that I could kind of give people a little bit more information on the whys, instead of just saying, hey, I bought all these parts that everybody else seems to buy for this car. I wanted to go into a little bit more detail. So, like I said, the first phase on this car is going to be a full suspension overhaul. Here's why I'm choosing the suspension first. I know most people buy these cars, and the first thing we all want to do is we want to pour money into them. We want to make them as fast as we possibly can. And I can certainly appreciate that. I did that with my M55 335i, which happens to be my daily driver, and the car's a rocket ship. It was a lot of fun. But when I bought this car, I told myself that I was going to do this build the right way. I was going to do it methodically, and I was going to make what I felt was the best possible 335is that I could build, that I could afford to build. So when I started doing my research, I realized, like most people realize, that the chassis, the E92 chassis is a good chassis, but the non-M cars really are lackluster in the suspension department. There are some parts that kind of leave you scratching your head, like a limited slip differential not being available. Some of the suspension components are weak, made of stamped metal. The bushings are very soft and pliable. From a marketing standpoint, I certainly understand why BMW did it that way, but from an enthusiast standpoint, there's a lot that needs to be addressed, and I wanted to be able to put 650 or so horsepower to the ground without it feeling like the car wanted to kill me. So the first stage is going to be to address those things so that when I get to the power adding stage, I have a confidence-inspiring chassis and suspension that can handle all of it. So let's go ahead and get into the front of the suspension, which I'm going to be tackling first. All right, so we're into the front passenger side of the car. And aside from coilovers that I'm going to be changing out, which I'll talk about in just a moment, the three main components I'm going to be changing on the front of the car are going to be the control arms, the lower control arm, front control arm, and then the sway bar. Okay, so on non-M cars, the reason these typically get swapped out by people is because they have a bushing here and a bushing here that are soft and compliant. The way BMW markets these cars, they're kind of marketed as a touring car, so you want them to be soft and compliant. You don't want the ride to be harsh. But when you're building a performance car, or when they built the M car, you definitely want to upgrade these to where it's a lot more stiff and a lot more direct in steering feel. So what a lot of people do is they upgrade to the M3 control arms, which bolt right up to this car. And the M3 control arm actually has a bearing here, which is a lot more precise. And then in a moment, I'll show you the control arm I went here, where I went with an upgraded bearing instead of the M3 bushing that's in the M3 control arm. Then what I'll be changing is I'll be swapping out this sway bar for a Ebach 27mm solid sway bar, and it has polyurethane bushings that'll come with it too. Okay, so I have the control arms off the front passenger side of the car. So this is your lower control arm, and these are technically called the tension strut. So I just want to go over the differences and why I'm making the upgrade. So if we look at the stock lower control arm, if I put the screwdriver in here, you can see how much I can move this bushing here. Now granted, there's going to be some movement here, but this movement isn't really precise. It's kind of just spongy, if you will. And then if we look at this M3 lower control arm, yes, it moves, but it's more precise, and this allows the suspension to articulate more precisely. Another thing too you may notice, if we line the locations up, you can see that the M3 control arm is longer. That's what allows for about 0.75 degrees more of negative camber. So you get a lot better tread wear and cornering out of this setup, okay? Now, if we look at the tension strut, again, put the screwdriver in here and just very little effort I'm doing right here. If you can imagine under hard braking or turning or braking into a turn, there's a lot of slop here. And as these go bad, which is very common on the E92 chassis, it really gets bad. You get clunking. This one's actually in very good shape, being that the car only has just over 54,000 miles on it. But you can see that this isn't, from an enthusiast standpoint, just not ideal. Now what I've opted for on any E92 car, this tension strut, the metal component or aluminum component is actually all the same. The only difference you get is what you choose here. Now this, if you look at a BMW 328i, a 335i, 335is, they all have this exact same bushing, but when you go to the M3, they use a very similar bushing style, but only it's a stiffer material. What I've opted to do is go with the Turner Motorsports. It's a sealed bearing. It's called the Monoball. And if I put my screwdriver in here, there is no movement at all. This thing is very precise, and it's going to be very precise feeling in turn in, under braking, and under hard acceleration. Okay, so here's the coilover kit I'll be using on my build. This is the track day suspension by a company called 3DM Motorsports. So basically what this is it's the standard OHLINS E90X non-M coilover kit, but it has upgraded spring rates, and they use Swift springs in place of the regular OHLINS springs. The biggest complaint you'll hear from people when they buy just the standard OHLINS kit is that the spring rates are too soft, especially in the rear of the car. So what 3DM Motorsports does is they swap the springs out in favor of a 400-pound spring in the front and an 800-pound spring in the rear. This is not an uncommon swap. There's actually a lot of people that have done it. But what most people don't do is when they increase the spring rates, they don't then have the dampener revolve to accommodate those spring rates. And that's what 3DM Motorsports does. 3DM Motorsports is one of the few OHLINS distributors in the United States that is allowed to revolve these dampeners and have them under warranty. In fact, the company does a lot of revolving work for warranty claims and such. So what he does is he changes the springs out front rear, and then he puts the dampeners on a shock dyno, and then they revolve them to accommodate it. So what you get is basically a custom kit for the E90X non-M cars. Barry, the owner of the company, talked to him several times by email, by text, by phone. He's a super nice guy. He's very responsive, and he probably has forgotten more about suspensions on BMWs than I'll ever know. He helped me with this kit. He asked me a couple of questions, and once he kind of knew what I was doing with this build, this is what he recommended. Another cool thing is it comes with Overhaul camber plates, 65 millimeter perch on the spherical bearing. Now, I've heard some people say that these camber plates, whether it's on this particular kit or other kits, does add a little bit of NVH to the car, but apparently the benefits far outweigh any kind of added vibration or noise that you get. Really super excited about putting these on the car. Okay, so I have the stock 335is sway bar out of the car. I have it laid next to the upgraded E-Bach bar that I'm going to be going with. I want to talk about the differences between these two bars, why I went with this specific bar. So for those of you who don't know, the 390X non-M front sway bar, number one, it's hollow, so it's made out of tube steel. It's 26.5 millimeters at its thickest point, but it tapers down here in the middle of the car, right down to about 23 millimeters. Now this bar, this E-Bach bar I'm going with, is a solid bar. It's quite a bit heavier.
Although it is adding a little bit of weight to the car, I think the benefits of the stiffer bar outweigh the increase in weight. So it's 27 millimeters and it's the same thickness all the way through, so it doesn't taper down in the middle right there. Why I went with this particular bar, so this was another conversation I had with Barry over at 3DM Motorsports about what to do with the sway bars front and rear. He recommended that I go with just a, this 27 millimeter bar, something from the aftermarket. I think he recommended an H&R bar. But when I was doing the price comparison, this is a 27 millimeter solid bar, powder coated red. The H&R bar is a 27 millimeter solid bar, powder coated blue. The H&R bar is twice as much as this bar. So that's why I ended up going with the IBOC. So if you're wondering why I chose this specific bar, that's pretty much why. Now, as I get into the next video or two where I do the suspension in the rear of the car, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about why I changed the front sway bar and why I'm not going to be changing the rear sway bar, which if you're anyone who's done any research on suspension on a non-M 390 or E90X car, a lot of people say the first thing you should do is swap out the rear sway bar because it's 14 millimeters, it's a very small bar. But after having conversations with Barry over at 3DM, he gave me a pretty good breakdown and rationale of why I would only change and stiffen up the front of the car and not the rear, especially using the coilover package that I'll be putting on this build. So when I get into that video, I'll go into a little bit more depth about sway bars and my sway bar selection.